Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we're going to dive back into more history of Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital. Trigger warnings for this episode include outdated and ableist language and descriptions of dependent adult abuse. My main sources for this episode include annual reports from Greystone Park, courtesy of the New Jersey State Library website, as well as the Images of America book on Greystone Park by Rusty Tagliarini and Christina Matthews. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital. We left off last week in 1924 after the hospital was officially renamed Greystone Park. As I mentioned last week, the hospital was in a bit of an economic boom, and they had many different construction projects going on at once to accommodate the growing number of new patients. By 1925, the hospital had established a new power plant and sewage system, a new dining hall for women, living quarters for 350 employees, and they were in the process of adding a new dining room for male patients. To this point, employees only served their own gender. So women staff with women patients, men staff with men patients, with the exception of psychiatrists, because there weren't women psychiatrists at the institution yet, but there would be soon. We generally think of nursing as a female-dominated field, and it was for a long while, but at this time, the majority of nurses were male. They needed what they called a preponderance of women, which is kind of funny to me because I usually associate the word preponderance in a legal context, like a preponderance of evidence. But anyway. By the end of the fiscal year 1925, there were 3,451 patients, 1,683 men, and 1,768 women. By this point, they were doing trial parole periods for patients in the community in preparation for their eventual discharge. There were 285 patients out on parole at the end of the fiscal year. The 1925 annual report offered a nice glimpse into the job of Dr. Lane, the clinical director. It reads as follows, quote, "Again this year, the clinical division has been supervised by Dr. Arthur G. Lane as clinical director. He is in charge of the examination of patients, conducts staff meetings, and advises treatments. He also supervises the social service division, instructs new physicians in psychiatry, and lectures to student nurses on this subject. A great deal of credit is due Dr. Lane for his untiring efforts to inspire the new members of the staff with an understanding of the principles involved in the examination and treatment of mental disorders, and an appreciation of the possibilities for service which exist in this field. He has constantly labored to improve the clinical methods and equipment and has been deeply interested in the construction program." End quote. Then Dr. Curry, the medical director, outlined some of the departmental highlights. They hired a contract psychologist to help with social work in the social work department, and I noticed that this psychologist wasn't listed on the official staff roster, so I sort of wonder if they were part of the off-site mental health clinic and not part of the actual hospital itself. And I guess to that point, there was at this time an outpatient mental health clinic in the community that would serve folks who didn't quite meet criteria to be admitted to the hospital, but who needed extra care. So in this way, it served to mitigate the number of admissions that seemed to increase every single year. The dental department started to focus more on focal infections, which is the process that Dr. Henry Cotton carried out at Trenton. They removed infected teeth that were believed to be causing or worsening a person's mental illness. However, at Greystone Park, they didn't conduct nearly as many of these procedures, and they made sure that patients who had teeth removed left with dentures. You may remember from the series on Trenton Psychiatric Hospital that visitors noticed many patients walking around toothless and unable to eat well. There were 126 war risk patients at the hospital, 104 in-house, and 22 who were out on parole. In 1925 alone, 44 veterans had been admitted, 21 discharged, and 1 transferred to Trenton, and 1 transferred to the Veterans Hospital in the Bronx, New York. There were frequent changes in medical staff during this year. 12 doctors appointed, 10 doctors resigned, for a total of 21 medical doctors. Dr. Curry made a point to add that the staff had a 9-hole golf course that was a popular source of amusement during breaks. So clearly that was a draw for interested applicants, or so it suggested. One thing I haven't mentioned thus far is that every year in either late summer or early fall, the hospital held a field day. And it sort of reminds me of a coworkers barbecue where there are games and activities and food. There would be a baseball game, 3-legged races, sprints, those sorts of things, along with booths. In 1925, I really think this is very cool, the patients, with staff help, of course, constructed a replica colonial-style kitchen and used it as a cultural and food experience. And I just think that is so cool. I think my patients would enjoy something like that. Most of them had a really negative experience in school, so I like to try to give them a restorative experience with learning, just for the sake of learning. And most of them eat it up. They realize that there's so much to learn and they love it. And it never gets old when I ask what they want to learn about. And it's usually big cats. They want to see lion cubs playing and how they survive in the wild. They love that kind of stuff. Anyway, I digress. All that to say that every year when they mention the field day, usually just a short note in the greater scheme of things, it makes me smile, and I appreciate the extra effort that staff went through to give the patients an extra good day. You may remember from last week that New Jersey passed a law in 1916 that allowed voluntary admissions to the hospital. Dr. Evans must have braced himself at the time for the influx of new patients, and that certainly was the case almost 10 years later. In 1927, there were 70 voluntary admissions, which was up from the 52 the year before. The total number of admissions was up 100 that year to 827 total. Of those, 692 were first-time admissions to a psychiatric hospital. The total hospital population had swelled to 3,524 patients in-house on March 30th, 1927. Even with the new construction, Dr. Curry must have been concerned about the growing number that saw no end in sight. There were many deaths that year, but 3 that were particularly unfortunate. In one instance, a patient who had worked a janitorial job killed another patient using his mop handle. Another patient died under mysterious circumstances after he was discharged home. And Dr. Curry seemed to wonder in his writing if something had happened at the hospital prior to his discharge that would cause such a sudden demise. And one person who was working died while working on digging a ditch. It sounds like it may have been of natural causes, but there weren't many details offered. On May 6, 1929, a fire broke out in the main Kirkbride building at Greystone Park. And here's how Dr. Curry describes it. Quote, "At 12:15 a.m., an alarm was rung in for a fire in the main building, which had broken out in the cupola on the roof over Ward 4-2 North. In the origin of the fire and the time it may have smoldered before being discovered have not been ascertained. Several people who were in the vicinity of the building, front and rear, reported that nothing out of the ordinary was apparent, and then between 5 and 10 minutes later, the whole cupola was a mass of flames. The local fire corps responded promptly, and all physicians, officers, and employees were on the scene in a remarkably brief space of time. Patients were aroused from sleep and formed in line as if going for meals. The discipline and habit established by the routine march to to the dining hall 3 times a day proved invaluable, and with a minimum of disturbance, the wards were emptied and the patients placed in safety in the amusement hall and congregate dining rooms. The bed patients were carried out, cots were set up for them and for the old and feeble, and coffee and sandwiches served to all. Some groups were entertained by community singing, and one popular request was, "Keep the home fires burning," end quote. I don't know about that choice of song, but anyway, during the chaos of the fire and evacuating the patients, 6 men escaped, although one was quickly found and taken back to the hospital. The estimated damage of the fire was around $1 million. Obviously, the main concern for administration was that now the already overcrowded hospital would have less area for patients to live. Fortunately, there was a new state hospital under construction in New Jersey at the time, but the Commissioner of Institutions and Agencies, William J. Ellis, said he wasn't planning to make changes to the new institution to increase the size because of the fire at Greystone Park. It's a bummer, but I also get it. I mean, the plans and budget were already in place. Construction was already happening. It would have been a lot to make changes at the last minute. By the end of the fiscal year, June 30th, 1929, there were 3,997 patients at Greystone Park. Every year, the number just got larger and larger. There were 889 admissions that year, 541 discharges, and 315 deaths. And of course, we know what happens next. In October 1929, the Great Depression began. Finances were tight, unemployment was high, and the U.S. was right smack dab in the middle of Prohibition. This made for terrible conditions in the community for regular folks. I imagine hospital administration must have anticipated an influx of patients for a number of stress-related reasons. Sure enough, by 1930, there were almost 200 more admissions over the previous year, for a total of 1,082 people admitted. The main Kirkbride building was still dangerously overcrowded due to the fire the previous year, which hadn't yet been fully restored. By June 30th, 1930, there were 4,244 patients, by far the highest census the hospital had ever seen. What made the situation even worse was that discharges were down considerably. People in the community simply couldn't afford to have their family members discharged to their care. They could barely take care of the people they had. As a result of what really feels like survival at that point, the average recovery rate that year went down to 27%, where it was usually in the 30-something percent. By the following year, the problem was even worse. There were 4,498 patients committed to the hospital and only 426 out on parole. The number of admissions had gone up by 400 that year to 1,465. 424 patients were transferred to other hospitals in an attempt to relieve overcrowding. Fewer than 500 discharged because of the economic problems in the community. There were 395 deaths. The 4th floor where the fire had gone through was still unusable 2 years later. Many staff members had burned through their entire life savings just trying to survive the Depression. In the midst of the economic turmoil, the annual Field Day celebration stopped for good. Dr. Curry's report in 1931 was particularly distraught. He writes, quote, "In the realm of disasters and other conditions beyond immediate control, this has been the most depressing year experienced during the period of my connection with the hospital and probably in the entire history of the institution. Last year in my report to you, I was obliged to refer rather frequently to the overcrowding and general stress which followed the Great Fire of May 1929, and which had been further increased by the unparalleled admission rate. At that time, I stated we must be prepared to make even more difficult adjustments during the coming year, but of the actual extent of the trials in store for us, I had no intimation." Early in the fiscal year, we had 2 serious fires in the old main building. One on October 30th in the roof above the men's wards, which had just been reconstructed, and one on November 26th in the center tower portion of the building above the staff living quarters and administration offices. The origin of the first has never been definitively established. The second was undoubtedly due to a defect in the electric wiring. In both cases, the water damage was greatly in excess of that of the flames, since both spread immediately to the old wood construction under the roof, and the water flooded all of the floors below. In one respect, neither of these fires approached the seriousness of that of 1929, since both occurred in the daytime and in a location where the immediate danger to patients was slight. When the first fire of this year took place, the adjacent top floor wards were unoccupied, but the patients were promptly removed from the lower wards. During the fire in the administration building, both men and women patients were taken from the tiers of wards nearest the center on each side and held in other parts of the institution. The multiple fires had a strong impact on the outward aesthetics of the hospital. In the Images of America book on Greystone Park, Tagliarini and Matthews show pictures of the damage caused by the multiple fires, which forever changed the ornate roofline of the hospital. They write, quote, "A new roof of wood and steel construction was immediately erected to cap the administrative portion of the Kirkbride building. Though it bore a resemblance to the original dome, this new roof was far less ornate in design. The uppermost floor of the entire facility was also altered to mirror that of the flat stonework walls on the floors below, doing away with the dormer windows and replacing the whole of the building with a plain, flat roof." End quote. Interestingly enough, as I mentioned earlier, the damage caused by the water that was used to fight the fires actually caused more damage than the fire itself. But still, each of these fires displaced patients and worsened the already overcrowded conditions.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Create Harmony is a podcast about setting an intentional rhythm and savoring God's blessings. In this place, we'll take a few minutes to celebrate everyday joys and remind ourselves how to notice goodness that is all around us. During the winter at Create Harmony, we shift our focus to all things cozy and snuggly. And while our days are shorter and darker, we stay attuned to the things that help us reset and restore. At the start of this new year, our podcast is filled with winter self-care, as well as ways to declutter and clear your mind. Check it out.
The patient population over the next several years only increased. By 1933, there were 4,672 patients. There was a large increase of deaths from respiratory diseases, 45 deaths from tuberculosis, which was up by 24 from the previous year, and 48 deaths from pneumonia, which was up by 11. And really, at this point, the hospital was merely warehousing people and treading water. There was no funding, the hospital was dangerously understaffed, and there were more and more patients coming in every year. I feel like I say this in every episode, but I just cannot imagine how exhausted and helpless the staff must have felt. I mean, it's practically nightmare fuel. I think about what my job would be like if we had similar staff-to-patient ratios. I essentially wouldn't be able to do my job. I'd be putting out fires, literal or metaphoric, all day long. But even the best, kindest, and most patient staff members must have been pushed to their limits. In 1935, the number of patients had jumped to 5,401, 800 additional patients in only 2 years. There were 1,526 admissions. And remember that once upon a time, the maximum capacity of patients at the hospital was 1,600, and now they were taking in that same number annually. The recovery rate had further plummeted to 25%. Dr. Curry explained in the annual report that the hospital could only safely house 4,000 patients, and they were over 1,400 over that number. This long excerpt from the 1937 annual report is what I call angry Dr. Curry, and for a good reason. Quote, "The number of admissions was the same as the year before, but as discharges lacked considerably below admissions, the hospital population showed further increase above what seemed to us the absolute limit of capacity 2 years ago. This was offset in some degree by the completion of reconstruction on the 4th floor of the South Side main building, so that all wards are now in service, including the annexes to the dormitory building, which were long ago condemned as unfit for use. Rising prices, particularly of food and clothing, are an evidence of prosperity which do not benefit the hospital population, though the value placed on farm and garden produce shows an improved balance." And just a side note, just to emphasize that Dr. Curry is right here. Increased costs following an economic depression are a good sign that the economy is bouncing back. Even the most rigid economy cannot keep within appropriations based on lower prices and smaller population. The most serious effects of increased employment and higher wages on the outside have been felt in the type and number of persons available for employment. Women employees, both graduate nurses and attendants, have been in numbers continuously below requirements throughout the year, and while more men have been available, the turnover has been very rapid. Wages were raised during the year, but only to a minimum of $50 a month. Hours have to be long, since we have neither money nor housing for more than 2 shifts. Living conditions, which is the point where a state institution should be able to make its strongest appeal, have been far from satisfactory during the year. Our quarters for employees are not adequate either in space or comfort, and our food service has reflected again rising prices and demands for economy. If a mental hospital is to maintain a position as a high-type modern curative agency rather than simply exist as a custodial institution, it is imperative that it have equipment and personnel to keep up with or initiate new and improved methods of care and treatment. A case in point might be cited in the insulin treatment of schizophrenia, which is now receiving widespread attention. In order to carry this out with any degree of safety and success, close observation and constant care are absolutely necessary, and this demands more doctors and especially more trained nurses. Under present conditions, even if money for salaries should be made available, lack of housing makes it impossible to maintain a sufficient professional force to carry on this therapy with any considerable number of patients. Another method of care which has proved successful in Europe and in some localities in this country is the boarding of selected patients in private homes in the community. With us, this would be highly advantageous as a relief to overcrowding, but it can be carried out with safety to the patients and the community only when there is close supervision by trained social workers. Our present force is already overworked, and in order to utilize the boarding out method of care, the number of social workers must be substantially increased, and additional automobiles and office workers must be provided. Overcrowding produces innumerable problems and clogs all the curative agencies of the hospital. It has reached a point where any kind of relief is eagerly accepted, and marked relief has been given this year in the form of transferring more than 200 patients to other institutions in the state. But even this relief has an unfortunate angle. Conditions at the receiving institutions, as they are usually at new ones, were such that the requirements under which patients could be accepted included that they be in good physical health, able to go to meals and get about without assistance, and not violent or greatly disturbed mentally. Since our own parole system has between 500 and 600 of our better patients in the community, the removal of 200 more of this type has seriously depleted our quota of workers, especially since similar transfers have been made for several years past. Our wards are now jammed with aged and feeble individuals, with the physically ill and the acutely disturbed, but it has been increasingly difficult to carry on the routine work of the institution because of the lack of reliable patients. This has been keenly felt on the wards, where it has always been customary for the better patients to assist in the care of the old and the feeble, and where the reduced number of employees and the increased percentage of patients needing constant care has made such help doubly important. It has been felt likewise in every outside activity of the institution. The drug room, the laundry, the dairy, and the garden all complain that their work has been hampered because of scarcity of classes and patients for whom their kind of work is a therapeutic measure. In a number of instances, it has been necessary to hire employees to do work formerly done by patients, which has increased our payroll without corresponding benefits. End quote. This must have been so frustrating, to say the least, for Dr. Curry. He sounds exasperated. And for what it's worth, I cannot imagine having so many patients take care of other patients. Think of the liability. But what else could they do? They didn't have enough staff to take care of the patients, and they couldn't just leave them on their own. I mean, all of this is so horrible and must have been a nightmare for patients who are incredibly vulnerable. And still, I can't help but think of the administrators who really genuinely sound like they wanted better for their patients. This wasn't the condition they wanted their patients to live in. There must have also been staff who took advantage of the circumstances and abused their authority. We know based on research, including some of my own research, that people with psychopathic tendencies tend to gravitate toward positions of leadership and authority. So when you have a vulnerable population like this and people who might be willing to take advantage of the situation, that again is the recipe for a horror story. The horrors, however, truly began in January 1937 when the hospital began implementing the use of insulin hypoglycemic therapy. We've talked about this in previous episodes. This is where patients are administered a shot of insulin, basically given a grand mal seizure, and then left in a coma for a short period. Dr. Curry reported on the first 78 patients to receive this type of treatment. 44 men, he said, and 34 women received insulin shock therapy. Of the 44 men, only 27 completed the rounds of treatment. Of those, 7 improved and 14 discharged, but 4 came back not long after. What happened to the other 6? It does not say. Of the 34 women, 3 died. 13 were unimproved, 10 were slightly improved, 2 were improved, and 6 were good enough to be discharged. Those are pretty bad odds, if you ask me. About a 10% chance of dying and about a 50% chance of having little to no improvement at all. It's not worth it in my book, but I'm sure that administration was desperate to find anything that would help. Metrazole shock therapy was introduced on a trial basis, although per the report, it sounded like insulin therapy was preferred with better comparative success. They were also trying out endocrine therapy and shortwave electrotherapy, although there were no reports out yet on their efficacy. Dr. Curry pointed out in the 1938 annual report that their neighboring states were implementing an 8-hour workday, and he believed that the hospital should start doing the same. This, he argued, would allow staff time to go home and rest before returning to work. He believed it would improve safety and the overall well-being of staff. He also advocated for returning their salaries to a higher wage as they had been in previous years. So kudos here to Dr. Curry for looking out for the best ways to retain staff and look out for their best interests. There were over 6,000 patients in the hospital by 1938, and unsurprisingly, that number only continued to rise. The hospital started construction again in 1939 once the worst of the financial slump was over. Dr. Curry said that they were losing physicians and other staff because of the poor and cramped conditions of the available housing. So they began construction for 4 wings to the dorm building and 2 housing units for staff. Most notably, the clinical director, Dr. Arthur Lane, stepped down from his position. He was replaced in 1940 by Dr. Lawrence M. Collins. Before long, World War II had started, and the hospital once again found itself in the thick of wartime struggles. And they had just started to get somewhere, too. The recovery rate had bounced back to 36.9% in 1941. There were only 5,490 patients in-house and 770 on parole. And their discharges were back up to a regular number, about 778 in 1941. In February 1941, electroshock therapy replaced metrazole shock therapy, and there were 2 EST machines in place. The U.S. entered World War II in December 1941, and once again, the draft took some staff members, and other defense industries like making powder, explosives, or airplane construction took other staff. Once again, understaffing had risen to a dangerous level. As war tends to do, more patients were admitted. By 1943, there were 6,413 patients, with 5,561 in-house. Interestingly, though, by 1944, that number had finally started to decrease. On June 30th, 1944, there were 6,337 patients total, with 525 in-house. The recovery rate that year even increased to 39.3%. And honestly, that increase was probably because of the shock therapy. I mean, to be clear, the way they went about the shock therapy in the mid-20th century was egregious because it was generally done without the patient's consent. But ECT has shown itself to be effective in some cases, and I do advocate for its use, but very, very sparingly and only as a last resort. By 1945, the Second World War was over, and Dr. Curry had been superintendent at Greystone Park for 25 years. He observed that many physicians were overworked as a result of overcrowding and of the poor hospital conditions, and that even some of those doctors had fallen gravely ill. Fortunately, many of the physicians who had been on military leave during the war returned within the year. Whereas at the beginning of 1946, there were only 18 physicians on staff, by the end of the fiscal year, so about 6 months later, they were back up to 27 physicians on staff. The only downside was that now staff housing was back to being cramped, especially for doctors who had larger families. It always seemed like this toss-up, and things were never really free of a downside. Per usual, the number of patients increased. Toward the end of the fiscal year, on June 15, 1946, there were 6,680 committed to the hospital and 5,753 in-house. Admissions had gone up by over 100 from the previous year, and there were 1,635 people admitted. Of that number, 285 were over the age of 70. Dr. Curry believed that these older patients constituted a real problem at the hospital because they required a lot of staff time, they didn't respond to the typical treatments that were offered, they couldn't work, and they rarely discharged. So he began advocating for older patients to be moved to their own facility where they could be better served in a smaller environment. I can't really disagree with him here. When they're already overcrowded and understaffed, it does make sense for patients who require a higher level of medical care to be sent to a different type of facility. We have the same problem today. Many state hospitals have at least one designated medical unit, but statistics show that the number of incarcerated folks over 65 is only going to increase over the next 50 years. There needs to be other facilities even today for this population. And before I started my doctoral program, I was advised by a psychologist at Oregon State Hospital to consider geropsychology because the next few decades will show an increased demand for it. And he was right. I'm seeing it already, and it's only going to continue. Now that the war was over, there were even more veterans coming to the hospital with psychiatric needs. The number grew so much that it became essential for the hospital to add its own veterans housing unit, which was completed in 1948. Dr. Curry hoped it would be temporary, but we know how slowly things moved around this time. Electroshock therapy continued to be used regularly to treat patients. An estimated 327 patients received electroshock therapy in 1948. Of those, 32 did not see improvement. 46 remained in the hospital as improved, and 249 were able to be discharged, although some did return to the hospital after a brief period. Life at the hospital was slowly starting to return to some semblance of normalcy. There was a veteran softball team that played regularly and a bowling tournament in May. There were dances and tea parties. Women who were undergoing shock therapy got some extra special recreation time. They were given cosmetics to use and extra gym time that focused on posture and physical rehabilitation. This is rather anticlimactic, but for some reason, the 1950 annual report is missing from the archives. And it's really too bad because that must have been the year that Dr. Curry retired or otherwise left his job as superintendent after 30 years. He was replaced that same year by Dr. Archie Crandall, who had been the assistant clinical director for about 10 years and had been the assistant medical superintendent in 1949. So he was well acquainted with the hospital and familiar with its operations, the perfect person to step into the role. And I think I'm going to pause the history of Greystone Park here. At the start of a new administration, there's a new war conflict coming up in 1950 that would again divert some staff to help with the war efforts. And we'll see what changes lie in store for the hospital. I'm going to try to wrap up the history next week, but as always, I like to let the history speak for itself, so I'll let the hospital tell me what it's going to do. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your support on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. That really is the best way to help others find and listen to the show. Be sure to come back next week for more information on Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital. And of course, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.